Welcome to The Machine, a podcast from Waterford Institute of Technology. My name is Rob O'Connor and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Computing and Mathematics here at the Institute. And today we're going to talk about the evolution of mobile development over the last number of years. I'm joined in the studio by some of our podcast regulars, Siobhan Drohan.
Hello, Rob.
We have Eamonn de Leicester.
Hi there.
Both of WAT. But today we have our first external people and we've roped in a couple of devs from the industry. We have Jason Blood, who is the engineering manager on the mobile team at Distilled SCH, and Padraig Howlin, who is the VP of engineering at Distilled SCH. If that name doesn't mean anything to you, the names DoneDeal, Daft.ie and Adverts.ie will, because that's what all those companies actually are. Lads, you're very welcome along.
Hi Rob, how you doing?
Thanks for having us, Rob.
No bother at all. Just get some interesting stats. Some people might think that DoneDeal.ie, that's somewhere where I go to, buy and sell second-hand phones. But have you got any kind of stats about you're one of the most widely installed apps in Ireland. One of the same with Daft as well as DoneDeal and Adverts. I mean, you have a ridiculous amount of views and engagements every day.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of monthly active users, if we combine the three apps, Adverts, Daft and DoneDeal, we'd probably have close to 1 million monthly active users, and even in terms of roughly active installs, we'd have roughly the same. So it's quite a large audience you're meeting, even in the concepts of just being mostly Irish websites. So
when we talk about scalability, this is really hitting you guys. I mean, if you're dealing with 1 million active users, I mean that's it's not trivial.
Yeah, no, it makes a huge difference. If you're working on your own personal apps at home and, you maybe have a couple of friends just using them, if you have a crash in the app, it'll only affect 1 or 2 people and you might not even notice it. But if you're having an app that's been used thousands of times a day, it makes it makes a lot more bigger of an impact if you make a mistake or, that kind of thing.
And that's it. So this is what we're going to talk about today, which is app development, because even if you're not into programming, the likelihood is you've interacted with some apps. And for a lot of people, it's perhaps their first engagement with a computer and a computing device now at this stage, particularly some younger people. But we might go back to the early days of mobile development, and maybe what we'll do is try to figure out how we got here from there. So it's 2019 now, but let's go back maybe kind of 20 years to the late 1990s, early 2000s, and what phones were then, what they could do, and I suppose the development opportunities of those. Now, most people here in the room are far too young to remember this, but not Eamonn.
Thanks, Rob. You always get me on that.
No, but okay. So I remember in the late 90s. I think I got my first phone in 2000, and there was practically no capabilities on it. It was calls and texts. That was about it.
Yeah, I think the first change that happened was batteries got portable. You didn't have to have a backpack to take around on your back. So once that happened, then the phones, although they didn't require a lot of power, they were very useful as a communication device. But they gradually achieved some textual communication as well. So the first step was SMS. I think that may have been first implemented in Ireland by an Irish company. I should check that before I came in. But SMS allowed people to not just talk but type. And then once you go beyond typing, you got a little form to fill out, or maybe you got settings on your phone to configure. And from there, then the first, I think, attempt at something like an app was a thing called WAP. You might remember that.
I do. I did some WAP development back in the day.
Yes.
Wireless
it was
horrible.
Access protocol, yeah. So it was a mini version of the web. It was promoted very heavily at the time.
Yeah.
.com, boom.
That's right. WML.
WML was the language.
Yeah, WML,
exactly.
Which is a kind of a cut-down version of HTML. It was absolutely horrible to deal with.
Yeah. So that was promoted heavily at the time. That opened up what you could do. You could check, sports results, I think was a big thing that they first pushed on it, and weather and the like. The next step after that then was to make the thing you're running on the phone an app itself. And the first attempts to that were early versions of Java, and also some native operating systems on the phones in those stages.
And some of the technologies would have been, we talk about Java, which is obviously still around today and still has one of the most widely used languages that devs are operating with today. But I remember J2ME, Java 2 Mobile Edition, Java 2 Micro Edition, which was kind of like a cut-down version of that. What was it like developing with those tools?
They were fairly primitive, really. Well, Java itself was still in its early days then, so it was only about 4 or 5 years out from Java itself arriving on the scene in 94 or 5. You had a very limited kind of vocabulary to learn, very limited set of user interactions or patterns that could be supported, but it was a start.
Yeah.
And it opened people's minds about carrying a computer in your pocket that could do something.
It's probably a stat I should have looked up before we came in, but I think I'm pretty right in that the most widely used and installed Java application on those early phones was Snake.
Yes, or Solitaire or something
Yeah,
like
something
that.
like that.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
it was, you remember Snake, that game that
Yes.
we actually made a comeback, I think,
Yes.
in the new Nokia phones that
Yeah.
have come out. It was fiercely addictive. So, but there was also kind of a conflict, or there was a different mindset back in those days about what a phone, compared to what a phone was compared to the way we think of
Yes.
it now.
Yeah.
And maybe you could just maybe describe what that is.
Well, at the time, it was a telecommunications device,
Yes.
not a computer. That meant that anything running on it was heavily controlled by the telecommunications companies at that stage. And they guarded that world very carefully because I think they saw the potential of the lucrative nature of it longer term. Because they were in charge, they weren't really software people, at least not consumer software people. The user experience was fairly crude, really, compared to what we already had at that stage on the desktop and in computers generally. Their stronghold on it gradually weakened over time as the platforms became liberated from their control, culminating in the arrival of iPhone and related products in the mid-noughties, late noughties.
Which I suppose brings us up to here, because this is now we're talking about the mid-2000s, and the Android is now in development. Andy Rubin and his team are developing that. And then in 2007, the iPhone is released. And I tell you what, I have a little clip of that as well.
So, 3 things. A widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone.
So that's January 2007. It's actually about 12 years ago when that was released. That was Steve Jobs first announcing the long rumoured at the time iPhone. And at that time, I think the biggest selling smartphone kind of handset would have been the BlackBerry. And I don't know, does anyone here have a BlackBerry?
No, well, they used to have them in the place I used to work in at the time, and it was the biggest thing about the BlackBerry was it had a QWERTY keyboard, and people just loved that you could actually type your full emails on it with your proper slide out QWERTY keyboard. So a lot of the people in business would have had it as a resource.
Any of you have BlackBerry?
My dad had one and he loved it. He absolutely loved it. It was like his baby, you know.
Actually, I have a clip that is indicative of that. And this is Steve Ballmer, who would have been the CEO of Microsoft at the time. And he was asked for his reaction to the launch of the iPhone.
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine. Now, it may sell very well or not. We have our strategy. We've got great Windows mobile devices in the market today. You can get a Motorola Q phone now for $99. It's a very capable machine. It'll do music. It'll do internet. It'll do email. It'll do instant messaging. So I kind of look at that and I say, well, I like our strategy. I like it a lot.
Now, hindsight is a wonderful thing, and it's very easy to, maybe kind of kick at Steve Ballmer. But that was the prevailing wisdom at the time. RIM with their BlackBerry were number one. Windows Mobile would have been, Windows Mobile 6 I think it was at the time, would have been a very widely used system. But the iPhone came along and just totally changed things. So it wasn't the first smartphone, but it's arguably the first smartphone that matters.
Yeah, there's one other anecdote about RIM and BlackBerry. Straight after the Steve Jobs' announcement, the BlackBerry team were called the development team were called into a meeting. And their opinion was that it wasn't possible, that the phone was almost certainly an animation and it wouldn't be out in the year ahead. So they felt they were safe. Felt they were still far enough ahead at that point.
Really, and I suppose the big difference here was this didn't have a keyboard. It was all touch screen. There were only a handful of buttons on it. And again, they really pitched the media capabilities, the music, and also the web browsing experience, which I remember I had a Nokia 6310 or something like that. Some smartphone thing that I would have had at the time, and the web that was on it was shockingly bad. It was unusable, largely. So here we are with the iPhone, and then a number of Android handsets start to come out in the market at the same time, Google pushing Android. So, and then in 2008, the app market comes out for iOS, and we're into a new paradigm for onboard phone applications. And they're called apps because they were seen as being small, so apps. And they didn't want to use the word applet, I think, because that had been used elsewhere and had connotations. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what it was like to develop an app for iOS or Android at that time, and the kind of tools that would have involved, the technologies. So I don't know who wants to go with that.
Sure, yeah, so I guess...
So go on, Jason.
In the early days, you would have had, like for Android, you would have had Eclipse and Java. It was the language you were mainly writing in. And then on the iOS side, you would have had Xcode and Objective-C. So in the early days with Java, it was kind of nice because people probably had a lot of that knowledge of Java in other places, like, as widely used language in other places towards the industry. Whereas Xcode was probably a bit of a bigger ask because there wouldn't be as many unless you were developing apps for the old Mac OS. So I think, the fact that iOS grew so quickly was very important because developers needed to get on board with that kind of workflow, and it's quite different from a Java environment.
So there was a big jump. So if somebody had developed, I suppose the key, and one of the key things I think with Android's early success was that if you had developed in Java before, besides the kind of the mindset of an app developer, you kind of knew a lot of the language. You might not know the frameworks, but you knew a lot of the language. Whereas in the iOS land, in Apple land, Objective-C was a very different type of language that, unless you'd used it before, was rather different. I don't know, Padraig, what you think?
When I saw Objective-C first, I thought, this is crazy. It was so different to anything else that I'd used before. And even getting your head around the concept, so, sending messages around, it just looked funny, and how verbose the method names were. But
they were very long, yeah.
Very, very long. And I know, when I started learning it, I found the learning curve quite steep, especially around the memory management side of things you had to deal with, which I guess wasn't necessarily something we had to worry about on the Android side. But it was enjoyable. It was a good language to learn.
And I suppose the thing about it is that it became quite popular amongst devs to work with these technologies, whether it was Android and the associated tools or iOS and the associated tools. And it largely shifted software around. I don't know, maybe, Eamonn, you might be able to reflect on that.
Yeah, I suppose the nearest thing we had to it in development terms at the time was GUI development, building Windows apps or Mac OS apps. And in fact, I guess Apple's first attempt was to bring over some of that toolkits into the phone world, although they were significantly cut down and reshaped. In the desktop, you had a kind of a keyboard and a mouse pointer. That's all you had to worry about. In these newer devices, there was touch. That was something new. And in the case of Apple, as they developed, you had multi-touch. So that generated a new kind of events that the program had to cope with, new types of user experience affordances that had to be managed. And that's quite a new world, really. Very tangible approach to software from the user's perspective, and I think more challenging than what we had previously in terms of new models that had to be invented, which we're still catching up on, by the way.
And I remember getting into app development around about that time, kind of back in the early days. And I remember trying Android. Actually, I was doing a class, a master's class in something, and we did a bit of Android in it very early on, and it was using probably the version 1 of the Eclipse plugin. Eclipse would be a IDE, integrated development environment, that would be very popular amongst developers around the world. And there was a plugin so you could use Android. But it was very clunky. It worked, and there was a simulator, but it was very clunky, and you needed a beast of a machine to run it.
Yeah, it took a couple of years really for it to stabilise. And I think the lads will probably know better than we would know of the struggles in the early years to get their app built and efficient enough. Perhaps I might have some views on that.
Yeah, so I think even one thing to keep in mind as well is back then as well, the phones were so much slower, so little memory in them that you would definitely have to spend a lot more time developing your apps and monitoring how the memory's performing. And whereas now these days the phones are so powerful that if you leak a bit of memory here and there, it's fine.
Yeah,
you don't need to worry that much. But even back then, the tools were so less advanced to measure that stuff that it was even harder to spot them issues. In some ways, on Android Studio or on Eclipse as well, there was a lot of pain points around even just adding basic libraries or that'd help you develop a bit quicker. So you could potentially use another library that was created by someone else that maybe you could use their expertise in an area. They could import into your project, and even doing basic things like that was really painful.
For the lads, if you had an app from 2010 or so, and you tried to take that code and build and run it now, how hard would it be, or would it be a big challenge, or would it be just not worth the effort?
I think it would be pretty nightmarish because, especially on Android, because you went from Eclipse or Android, I guess. We'll probably be talking about this a bit later, but Android have switched from Eclipse to being the main environment to Android Studio, which one of the big things with Android Studio that came along was the build system Gradle, which meant it quite changed how the project was set up, and I would very much suspect the import tool would not fare too well on a very old project.
So we'll come back to that in a minute, but I'd like to go to yourself, Siobhan, just for a second, because one of the big things about the app model as such that was really switched me on was seeing non-technical users using apps. And you can use my dad as an example, who got a smartphone and he loved it because he could go on holidays and click on the RTE app on his phone and get the news. And that was a big thing, and there was no, and again, technically you could have done that through a website. You could go to a website, you could go to m.rte.ie or whatever it was and get that information. I don't know, was there any of those kind of moments for you, Siobhan?
Oh, I just absolutely adored it from the moment I got it, from playing games and everything. It was, but the ability to be able to just search up things really fast was, to me, the biggest thing on it is the browser for me. I just love being connected to the internet the whole time. And even things when you go away on holidays, I love the maps.
Yeah.
Being able to just go, where are we? Oh, yeah, I know exactly where we are and here's where we go. You don't have to go looking for a map when you go to a new hotel in a new city, pick it out. And, you can also go restaurants, where'll I eat? And the phone will tell you if you really want it to tell you. There's just the whole connectedness of every single possible thing that you might possibly ever want is available. Just go up to your app store, download it, and you have every capability you want at this stage.
And again, those are all made by developers.
So,
and make those apps,
And it's even the connectivity of being able to connect to AI things at the moment, being able to connect through your phone through Alexa, turn on your lights, switch on your heating. It's mind-boggling what you can actually do now. Thank you, developers.
Right, so then we fast forward a couple of years, and there is a big shift in the app development tools, in that Apple go and announce a new language, Swift, still using Xcode, which they're still using, but Xcode is incrementally updated every year. Swift is a brand new language. It takes in a lot of, it builds on, it gets rid of Objective-C, although Objective-C is still supported. And it brings in a lot of concepts that are found from functional programming and also from scripting languages, which we would have spoken about in our web development podcast a while ago. And then not long afterwards, Google announced that Kotlin, which is a language developed by JetBrains, is now going to be a fully supported environment or a fully supported language for Android. So, I mean, maybe what we might do is we might ask Eamonn or Siobhan about what the developments of those languages were, and then maybe ask yourselves about what that meant for actual full-time developers building a mission-critical system. So, Eamonn, what did those languages and tools bring to app development?
The first thing they do is you write less code.
Yes.
So the language is more expressive and more powerful. Concepts are slightly higher level than we had before. There's a kind of bit of folklore in software development that the productivity of an average developer lines per day is 5, funnily enough. Not 500, it's 5.
Right.
But it's also the case that it doesn't matter what language.
Is this like, there's a famous quote about James Joyce. James Joyce, somebody was asking, you didn't do any work today. He said, I did. I put a comma in this morning and I took it out this afternoon.
Exactly. That's very apt, but semicolon in our case.
Yes, yeah.
But the point is that it doesn't matter what language it is. So if your language is more efficient, you're still writing 5 lines, but those 5 lines do a lot more. And that's what the trend is in all aspects of development, not just mobile, but particularly in Swift and Kotlin, because the amount of boilerplate and repetition is cut down dramatically.
Hugely, yeah. And that's one thing that we definitely noticed is like simple things like writing one piece of code. You could write 100 lines down into about 5 lines. And it also gives you a lot of, from a technical perspective, Kotlin helps you a lot in that it provides, we can start getting technical here, like null safety. So that you're going to, if anyone here has ever coded in Java, the dreaded null pointer exception, Kotlin helps you out with that a huge amount. And when you do code in your app development, that is something that is gold dust, to be honest, to avoid situations like that. I suppose Kotlin would have come around in 2011. And it runs on the virtual machine just like Java does. And anything that you code on the virtual machine you can use to develop your Android apps. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why it's usable in it. And that since it was announced then in 2017 it's going to be used it's fully supported by Android Studio, it's taken off.
Yeah. So then we go to Jason and Padraig from, we'll just say DoneDeal, because that puts, or Daft.ie for, the property barons amongst us. What did that mean for you guys?
Well, I can remember when me and the guys I was working with at the time, we were all Objective-C developers.
Yeah.
Online in the evening time looking at WWDC when it was announced, and we're all like furiously messaging each other, look at this is amazing. Objective-C, at that point we all loved iOS. iOS was amazing. But Objective-C was like this kind of thing we had to deal with. It was a difficult language, let's say, or kind of a verbose language to work with. So when Swift came along, it was so like, not to get too flurry, but it was a lot more elegant and it was a lot nicer to write. Yeah. So I think the community just jumped on it as soon as it came out. So I know on the DoneDeal side we jumped on it and got a lot of code over onto Swift 1 as soon as we could. I
wonder if I could be biased here, because I certainly would have had my foot in the iOS land firmly at that point. First off, I was watching that WWDC as well, and I was like, oh, this is cool, and then immediately thought, oh no, I'm going to have to code, because I had a nice set of notes, I had a program ready, and I was like, yeah, this is reasonably good now, this is good shape, and then I'm going to have to rewrite all of this, and blah, blah, blah. My experience of Android at the time, where the tool set were quite clunky, it was still the Eclipse plugin, Android Studio hadn't been released yet. I found it very clunky, and just from speaking to any of my friends who were Android developers, or worked in multi-platforms, they prefer developing for iOS just because it was a nicer experience, despite Objective-C being a very clunky language. So I don't know, would you agree with that, Jason?
I'll pass over to Jason, our Android expert here.
I would 100% agree. So like I even remember back in the day, compared to iOS, it felt like iOS, if you want to set up an iOS project, it's just a one-click thing. It opens up, you're on your way. Whereas Android, back in the day of Eclipse and all the dependencies, it would seem like you'd have it working 1 minute, then the next day you open it up again and it's broken again. And it's just, I don't know, Eclipse was a pretty hard time, to be honest, I think, and the plugin was so buggy as well. Yeah. The emulators were so slow, and even then, like, you wouldn't always be able to test on a phone because you maybe only had a couple around at your disposal, so, having a slow emulator was a real killer, whereas I think the biggest one on iOS was the simulator. It's a simulator on iOS, which is slightly different, but it's more or less the same thing, really. But
so the simulator is, if you're developing, you kind of have a virtual phone on your screen where you can test your app out. Yeah. That's what that is, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And just the iOS one was so much more performant, so, it was much handier to use that, and your development speed would just be so much quicker because of it.
Yeah. Now, but then we shift on to Android Studio, which is developed by JetBrains, who also developed the Kotlin language. And I'm assuming, I'm not aware of this, but I'm assuming Google had some sort of a hand in the development of Android Studio. or some sort of guiding hand anyway, certainly. And this is a big game changer for Android development. Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. Like, so Android Studio kind of came from JetBrains IntelliJ IDE, which is their main IDE for Java, and Android Studio is kind of the extension of that with all the Java tools. But the biggest thing that came with Android Studio, and it was obviously a collaboration with Google as well, was the fact that you could start using Gradle as a build tool for Android, which was a huge improvement, because that gave you things like managing third-party libraries, which would allow you to add code from other people more easily in Java, which would speed up your development, which is really painful.
So what is a build manager? It's something that allows you to pull code from. Just explain what that is.
Basically lets you. It basically lets you compile the app, but bring all the different parts of it together, and it lets you do nice things, like it lets you change things dynamically as you're building. So, for example, one thing that was a bit painful in the early days of Android was you might want to have like a test environment. You might have a test environment when you're development, and you might have a live version of while you're development. So, for example, in Adverts, Daft, or DoneDeal, if we're developing a feature, we'll have a test environment. That's just a mimic of the live website, but it just means we can change things on the test environment without breaking it for users.
Yes.
But in the old days of Eclipse and stuff, it was a lot harder to just swap out, like, switching between a test environment, which might just be a case of switching out a URL to the basically the website you're calling to. But Android Studio kind of gave you the power, I should say Gradle kind of gave you the power to much easily do that kind of stuff.
So Gradle is it's a build manager, and without getting too technical, it basically allows you to configure your project a little bit easier, and again to pull in libraries and dependencies, which would be things that your code is dependent on in a more cohesive manner than what was there previously. Is that fair, would you say? Yeah,
I think that's fair. And I think another big thing for Android Studio was the Eclipse plugin for Android. I always felt like it was just kind of something slapped on top of Eclipse, whereas Android Studio was obviously a collaboration between IntelliJ and Google, where they decided how's the best way to integrate it. So I think the fact it's this Android specific IDE really makes things a lot easier, because it allows Google to make the customizations that allow developers to get some nice things for specifically Android development. Whereas with Eclipse, it wasn't like its primary purpose, it was just an addition.
Yeah. So seeing as Android Studio was built on top of IntelliJ, which is developed by a company called JetBrains, and JetBrains are the crowd behind Kotlin, was it inevitable that Kotlin would be fully supported by Android?
I don't actually think so, to be honest. I was actually quite surprised, if I'm being honest, when Google announced that they're kind of going down the Kotlin route.
Is this because Google have been developing a language for a while called Go, haven't they?
Yeah, so I think a large portion of it is because Kotlin, to get a bit technical, Kotlin is still a JVM language, so it actually can interrupt with Java, which meant that if you want to add Kotlin into an app, they could potentially do it in a way that's just, they could do a piecemeal as opposed to doing it all in one go. But I think in a lot of ways, Java, the reason Google moved from Java is probably more legal reasons than technical reasons, because that whole big Google Oracle case.
Eamonn, you're shaking your head and nodding your eyes at the same time.
Yeah, I guess when politics and kind of corporate affairs enters the world, developers tend to throw their eyes to the heavens, really. But Oracle didn't invent Java. It was invented by Sun. And of course, Oracle acquired Sun over this period, and after the acquisition became much more guarded about their intellectual property. And a big court case, which is still ongoing, I think, still not fully resolved, between Google now and Oracle around the licensing of Java. So Kotlin may be another reason for doing it would be that they can hedge their bets in case some of those appeals don't go their way.
Right. Okay. So what we've been talking about so far is native app development. And when we talk about native app development, that means developing for a specific platform using the official set of tools, shall we say. But there's another one, which is cross-platform development, or hybrid, or web app. Could maybe one of you explain what that is? I know, Eamonn, you go for it.
So, I mean, people are wondering why we're obsessed about our tools, but we've learned two completely different tool sets to target Android and iOS. So the holy grail has always been learn one tool set and you get an app for either platform.
So why hasn't it happened?
It has happened. This is the point. It has happened several times, and several attempts have been made, and each one has usually fallen up short. Even a user, I think, using an app might be able to detect a slight clunky feel around some of the apps they're using. Usually an indication that there's some level of remove there between the app you're using on a native phone. I think the lads probably have experienced that in their early days.
So what from a user's point of view, maybe, what is that clunkiness?
I think it's the buttons just take a little bit longer to press. You can also see it. The fonts look slightly out. And the overall performance is just slightly off. Now, on a very fast phone, you might notice it. But on an older phone, you definitely would. And connoisseurs would be...
I think it's a perception thing, because those web views, if you're clicking on that button in, let's say, Safari or Chrome, it's acceptable. But when you're doing it inside a native app, it feels slow.
So this is where essentially you write a web application, like a mobile website, and then you wrap it up so that it appears to the user like an app. Is that what this is?
That's essentially it. Yeah, you write your JavaScript, HTML, CSS, you wrap it up and put it inside, for all intents and purposes, a browser inside your app. So you launch the app like a native app, but it's HTML and JavaScript in the background.
And there's been a number of, I suppose, tools or platforms that support this. I remember PhoneGap back in the day. There's a couple of ones that are out there now. Xamarin, which is a Microsoft one, where you write apps in C#. I don't know how popular that is. I've never used it. I have no idea.
No, we've never used it.
There's React Native, which is a Facebook thing. I don't know. I've never used it. See, there's mixed feelings about it. You use that, do you?
No, we've played around with it, but we don't use it in our apps. We use it we use React for our websites.
Okay.
I think the feeling is that it's not a bad idea, actually. And I think, let's say, if I was to have a startup in the morning, I might use it. But I think where it might fall down is when you want to do something a little bit more advanced, or a little bit something closer to the metal of the phone. That is, if you're using the native language, you've got more control there. I know, like Airbnb were heavily involved with React Native.
They dumped it all.
They
completely.
recently backed out.
So they're just gone full Kotlin and full Swift, isn't it?
Yeah.
They did say nice things on the way out, though.
Yeah.
I think one of the important points as well, with like React Native and also Flutter, which is a similar thing, is that, though, at least with the things like Xamarin, or however you pronounce it,
I'm not sure. Xamarin? I'm not entirely sure actually myself. It starts with an X.
Yeah, they kind of translate the web, it's kind of like more or less wrapped around a web view, whereas React Native and so on actually kind of builds native UI components, which is the big difference. Like, it still is a real app. To use that term, real, but like that's one of the big differences. But I think, it depends on what you need.
So I suppose the drawback of this is that there is a perceived diminishing on the user's experience. And user experience, or UX, or whatever you want to call it, seems to be a very important part of the app paradigm. I don't know, maybe Siobhan, you might reflect on that.
Yeah, if you've ever downloaded an app that doesn't appeal to you looks wise, you generally don't use it. So there's a huge amount of theory behind it, and making sure that your material design is correct and that you've got the right colours, and and usability, that you've always had whenever you browse something, you don't want to have to click 4 or 5 times to get into something. You want to be able to see it straight away and be able to get access, navigate really fast through the app. So the user experience matters, just like it does with the website, that it's all the same, translates down into app level as well.
Yeah. I mean, and you guys, how important is user experience in the DoneDeal family of things? I mean, your colours are quite, certainly DoneDeal, the colours are very famous. The kind of the yellow and the red, and then Daft as well. Even the logo for Daft, they're quite, and the colour scheme this year, it's very, it's consistent.
Yeah, I think so. So we're slightly changing it. We're slightly changing it a bit on the DoneDeal side at the moment. We're kind of gradually starting to move a little bit away from the yellow. The red is still there for us. But yeah, I think so. Like even adverts, you can, like, that orange is very distinctive. I think from a UX point of view, the best example I have of the importance of it is when we, years ago now, when we redone the DoneDeal app, we introduced a burger menu because we had all of our menu items hidden behind.
Sorry, what's a burger menu? You might just explain.
Burger menu is it's a button that will be in the top left right hand corner of the left or right hand corner of the app, and you click on it and a menu appears from the side. So when we did that, we were getting hammered in our app reviews. We were getting 1-star, 2-star reviews, and it was all down to navigation and people not being able to find their way around the app. And when we backed out of that and brought in a toolbar and just started using standard iOS navigation elements, we saw our ratings go back up to like 4 and 5. So like it's our users want to buy something or they want to sell something. They don't want to care about navigation items, so it has to be intuitive and easy to use. And
yeah, there's something like a 10-second rule, I think, with apps. Might even be shorter. That if it doesn't make sense on that first download, good luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Buying a car is a complicated thing. So your job is to buy a car. It's not to try and figure out how do I manage this app or how do I find my way around it. The app should almost fade into the background. Yeah. So it's important that you have to get that right.
And of course, there's a huge amount of skill involved in that. It's not trivial.
Absolutely,
yeah. Right, I'm a big fan of cooking analogies. Okay, so I've been kind of making a couple of notes here on what we've been discussing, and I'm going to try and put it into some cooking analogies. Often we use the developer as a chef. Okay, so the developer is a cook in a restaurant. Would you say if you're a developer who's been cooking in a high-end restaurant, moving to an app model is maybe like moving to one of those high-end hipster food trucks? Would that be fair?
You a hipster, Jason?
You don't have to be a hipster, okay? nshipster.com, which is a great website, by the way.
I think it was a bit hipster. I think it's somewhat why I got into the mobile development, because it was new, it was kind of exciting, and I think it is fair to say it was a bit hipster. I think it's a bit normal now, so I think it's quite out of the hipster zone now.
Okay, but it's also moving from a kind of a big restaurant to a food truck, if you know what I mean, in that you're still cooking. If you think cooking is like writing code, but you're moving to, I suppose, a different environment.
Yeah, I'd say, to continue the analogy, you also have to be able to drive the truck.
Yes.
And you're doing some repairs, you're fixing punctures and stuff along the way, and you're a mechanic for a truck. So it's an expanded role to a certain extent from old style enterprise development.
And to take that analogy a little bit further, Android and iOS are two different types of food trucks. One is, I don't know, vegetarian falafel truck, and the other one is barbecue, meat roasted over a flame truck, in that they both essentially serve food from the truck, but they're two different types of food. Would that be praise? Or actually, no, maybe a better one is that one comes in a wrap and the other one comes on a plate. that maybe.
Well, I think the other one, the Android truck, actually is 50 trucks. Okay. There's so many different versions, whereas the Apple one is one truck.
Okay, and that's maybe why why can't you serve all of that from the one truck? If we were talking about the kind of the cross-platform, because you're trying to do barbecue, multiple types of barbecue, and your lovely veggie falafel from the one type of truck, and it just doesn't really work properly yet.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. Like what an Android user expects is slightly different than what an iOS user expects when they go to use an app. And even from a development point of view, you often see you're an Android developer or an iOS developer. I think Jason is one of the few people who's senior at both. But yeah, I think people follow a path and they stick to their OS. Yeah.
Now, to go a little bit further and possibly peer into the future, I was reading about cross-platform model code or cross-platform logic, that rather than trying to do cross-platform whole app, let's just do part of it. And I believe Kotlin has these capabilities. Now, I haven't tried it, I've only read about it, I don't really know much about it at all. So using your analogy, would this mean that we could possibly have a supplier or some fella who's sitting behind the food trucks chopping vegetables or doing something like that can provide ingredients to both our lovely falafel wrap, our falafel food truck, and equally our multiple barbecue food trucks? Would that be possibly where this could go in the future?
Possibly, but I think it's quite difficult because we have Apple versus Google basically, and I think as long as that kind of barrier exists and there's no real standard, it's kind of hard to break from that. So there is things like Kotlin, I think it's Kotlin Native, I think it's called.
Yeah, Kotlin Native. Yeah.
Where you could potentially start sharing some of your model code across it, but end of the day, you're relying on JetBrains to keep supporting Apple, and Kotlin Native, the next app release or iOS release could break, and then you're relying on JetBrains and so on. So in kind of a big production app, you'd be very wary of adding that kind of layer. Whereas maybe in your own personal project, you might do it, or maybe if you're a small team, you might see the benefits of getting being able to just write it once and use it in multiple places. And that's somewhat the dream for these shared platforms as well, is to write it once and have it available everywhere, ideally web, mobile, or iOS, Android. But I think in practice it doesn't really come down to that, because you always end up writing specific Android code, specific iOS code, which kind of defeats the purpose.
So the Google barbecue trucks, the back door is open, but the Apple falafel truck, the back door is closed. And we can't,
so.
we can't get it in.
We're working hard not to stay with you there, Rob.
Yeah, I'm getting hungry now. Right, so let's just finish up with this. Say somebody was saying, do you know what? I've never tried a bit of app development. I'd like to give it a go. Would you have one bit of advice for them? Maybe we'd start with Siobhan.
Well, I suppose you'd want to be some level of a developer to even attempt it at this stage, to do proper app development. So if you have any sort of a object-oriented language, you could definitely download the Android Studio package and start start following videos on YouTube on how to build a basic app.
Yeah, so maybe do some other programming first. And if you go back to some of our earlier podcasts about getting started in computer programming, we've got lots of great tips on that.
That's it. But they would definitely have to have had their toe in the coding field
beforehand. Eamonn?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit harder than in other environments to start, certainly. But you could download Studio, press New, press OK about 5 times, and then press Run, and then just see what happens.
Yeah.
You won't be able to do anything really until you've done, as Siobhan says, spent maybe half an hour watching a video, then dipping back in your toes gradually.
Yeah.
And we'll put out a link to our courses, so anybody listening here will get a link to a starter course.
Excellent, fantastic. And I suppose just to put a pitch in for the iOS people, you could also, if you have a Mac, you can download Xcode and do the same kind of thing there, but good luck with you trying to navigate it completely as a virgin developer. And lads, maybe yourselves, what would you recommend?
I would say just try and start with a basic app and keep building it up, adding features, because really at the end of the day, the only way you're going to get better or learn it is just by doing it.
Yeah.
So I'd say it may be a little bit harder. So a bit of programming experience is useful first, but it's something to stick at. Like if we look at the millions of visitors we would have to DoneDeal, I think it's 6 to 1 are on a mobile device. So if you're in any way going to be using or building something that the user's going to interact with, mobile is where things are going. So it's a good thing to stick with.
Brilliant. Right, well, I think that's a nice place to finish on. So to Jason Blood and Padraig Howlin of DoneDeal, Adverts.ie and Daft.ie, aka Distilled SEH, although that doesn't have the sexiness of the other ones. To Eamonn, Leastar and Siobhan Drohan of WIT, thank you very much for being part of this episode of The Machine. I said I was going to do a website over Christmas, and I didn't, because I spent my time playing Mario Party on the Switch with the kids, to be honest with you. So I haven't got it done, and I just...
You can build a web app.
Yeah, we have a Twitter account that is kind of active, machine_podcast. So if you want to send us an old tweet at that or get in touch, please do. Or you can find any of us by just looking us up on the WIT website. We're going to be back. We're going to have we've programs scheduled in for the rest of the 2019 semester. So keep an eye on this podcast, because hopefully we'll have plenty of content coming soon. Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you, Rob.
Cheers, guys.